I'm here, I'm present. This is my first time presenting at a conference via Zoom, so I'm still um, figuring things out. I wanted to start, first of all, and I have 20 minutes for this, right? Just to be sure, give or
Yeah,
take.
that's right. Yeah,
Okay.
please go ahead.
So I wanted to start, first of all, by thanking the Center for Law and Policy Research, as well as VQ for inviting me to this. It's 6 a.m. here, so I hope I don't come across sounding a little too loopy or crazy or emotional. It's just that that time of the morning. I also really want to thank Grace and Pavel for allowing me to share the space on the stage, I guess, behind you. It is really an honor and a privilege to be able to think out loud with both of you. I've sort of followed your work along with VQ's for a really long time, and I really feel happy and proud about the kinds of work that you all are doing and that you're allowing me to kind of bear witness to it. As perhaps somewhat of an unfamiliar face to many people in the audience, I thought I would just introduce myself again. So my name is Brian Horton. I go by he, him, his. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts. My primary fields are anthropology, women, gender, and sexuality studies, and I specifically focus on queer studies, critical race studies, and South Asian studies. So all of my research is based in India, most of it in Bombay. I've been traveling to India for the last 8 or 9 years, mostly to Bombay, where I've done most of the research for the book I'm currently writing. I'm going to talk today about two projects, the first one a little less and the second one quite a bit more. So the book I'm currently writing is a book called Shimmers of the Fabulous. And in that book, I ask what I think is a relatively innocuous yet hopefully provocative question, which is, can queer and trans life in India be thought of as fabulous? And in this project, I sit with a range of spaces, so parties, cruising sites, pride parades, virtual worlds, and I sit with these spaces in all of their beauty, but all of their complexity and fucked upness at times. And I want to explore the kinds of creative, pleasurable, and at times joyful worlds that queer and trans people produce in spite of ongoing legal debates about queer life. In thinking with and against longer histories of queer representation in India that compel public reproductions of suffering, trauma, or crisis. So for instance, think about the ways in which legality demands that trans people visibilize their pain, or that gay people sort of present their suffering in order to gain rights. I instead ask and wonder how the archives and materials that I'm working with offer troubling yet potential instances of ordinary practices of freedom through desire. Or to think with queer of color scholar Jose Munoz, how a desire for things yet to come, things that are unfinished, or futures that have yet to be realized might actually be the substance of queerness. And that's the book I'm currently working on, but I was kind of called by VQ to present on this panel, which is about race, gender, and caste. So I thought I would talk a little bit more about my next research project, which I was supposed to kind of do some work on this past year. I was in India from December 2019 until March, and then COVID happened and I had to leave very quickly. Otherwise, I would probably still be stuck there. So in my next project, I explore what I'm calling the queer life of anti-Black racism in India. Sitting between Delhi, Bangalore, and Bombay, this project builds on my ongoing interest in the scenes of racial encounter between recent migrants from the Black diaspora and Indians living in major urban centers across India. I'm primarily going to look at Delhi, Bombay, and hopefully Bangalore at some point. I'm in the beginning stages of theorizing forms of racial consumption, so things like eating, sex, spectatorship, so watching or witnessing, to explore what I'm calling the queer life of anti-Black racism. So from films like Priyanka Chopra's Fashion, which I'm sure many people in this audience have seen, with that very horrid climax scene where she sleeps with a Black man and then suddenly has an emotional breakdown, to gossip about Africans living in India as cannibals, which appear often in local newspapers, to videos of attacks on Africans in public spaces. This project seeks to explore the kinds of trouble that Blackness poses not merely in public spaces like the bylanes of neighborhoods like Kirki in New Delhi, but also as a larger problem for thought and for thinking about contemporary forms of violence, exclusion, marginality in India. So how do we add questions of anti-Blackness to the sort of already existing archive of violence and marginality that is quite robust and that we can sort of talk extensively about? So in this panel, which is aptly titled Caste, Race, Gender, Thinking Through the Intersections of Trans Identity, it may seem a little strange that I'm talking about race and that I'm talking about anti-Blackness. But part of what I'm wanting to do in thinking out loud with this next project is to show the ways in which I think this question of race and racism that's unfolding in major urban areas in India is itself a queer problem and is also a problem for how queer politics is organized and organizes itself in India. And so I'm going to kind of take what will sort of be some seemingly long detours to get to, I think, what I'm suggesting is sort of the larger intervention of this project. One of the things that I think sort of shapes both my current project on sort of queer representation in India and this new project on race is I'm deeply interested in questions of beauty. That was a thing that came up a lot in my field work. So particularly when I was talking to sort of young urban gay men in places like Bombay, they would always talk about knowing that being gay meant that they needed to become more beautiful or more attractive. And what that meant were particular habits around consumption needed to change, particular forms of dress needed to change. They needed to put on more muscle weight or not be fat, etc., or not be so femme. And what the sort of question of beauty curated for me in those conversations was that a lot of the violence that we're talking about when we talk about queerphobia and transphobia is not simply a violence that exists at the level of the law or that exists at the level of the state. Some of it is so deeply ingrained in the kinds of categories that we imagine in our sort of ordinary daily lives as beautiful or as desirable. So for instance, I think when Pavel was talking, she was talking about sort of this idea of how Northeasterners are exoticized, right? And in fact, she actually made a reference to Blackness. And I think that those kinds of subtle nuances, right, around the ways that certain forms of life are imagined as being more desirable or less desirable than others, right, to me really shapes the contours of this project. So thinking in this new work I'm doing on race, I'm trying to think about how questions around anti-Blackness are also coinciding with these larger, what I would call kind of nationalist beautification projects. So if we think about the kinds of neoliberal reforms that are happening across India, if we think about the recent mess with things like love jihad in Uttar Pradesh and the sort of hubbub that's been made around that. These are all these sort of projects that are really talking about what the state, but also what sort of dominant ideologies imagine as beautiful futures or a kind of the forms of presentation and desirability that should be represented, right, as being part of sort of India's sort of nationalist future. And I'm kind of really trying to unpack the ways in which Blackness intervenes in those conversations. So what I want to do is talk very briefly about some examples of some of the incidents that I'm working with in this project on race, and hopefully swing back to talk about how I think I can connect them to the larger issues around transness and also caste. So the first instance is from Delhi in 2017. So this involved a student named Manish Khari, who was a class 10 student from Greater Noida who went missing from his home. With no indication of his whereabouts, his family, friends, and neighbors combed the streets in search of him. As the hours passed, rumors swirled that neighbors had seen Manish socializing with 5 Nigerian men who lived 2 doors down from the flat where he and his family resided. So when a mob comprised of Manish's family and other colony residents barged into the home of the Nigerian men who lived in this locality, they found absolutely no trace of Manish. According to several reports in major newspapers that would later chronicle the events, the mob searched these men's refrigerator. With no signs of Manish in the apartment, the mob's logical conclusion was that the 5 men must have eaten him, cannibalized him without leaving so much as a bone or leftovers. Though Manish eventually made it home, he was experiencing a severe drug high and was eventually taken to the hospital by his parents, where he later died. Soon after Manish's death, his family members organized what was supposed to be a silent protest to commemorate his life and supposedly reclaim this neighborhood. The group walked through the streets of Noida holding signs that said that Nigerians were unwelcome and that they were criminals that needed to be sent home. And so the intensity of this moment eventually erupted into what became a full-out race riot, where CCTV cameras and grainy footage from those cameras captured mobs of men from this locality in Noida, violently attacking anyone who, quote, looked like a Nigerian, which we can unpack the fraughtness of what that even means. And so in fact, if you see some of the video, it's really troubling footage of one man who is basically face down being attacked with dustbins, projectiles, people throwing fists, people tearing at his clothing. And this was in fact one of the videos that went sort of viral around the world, but particularly in India, so much so that the external minister, or the Minister of External Affairs at the time, Sushma Swaraj, sort of had to chime in, and she said that it's not right to connect attacks on African students with racism. She also added at the time that India, as the land of Gandhi and Buddha, could not possibly be racist. Now, anyone who studied Gandhi's history, particularly when he was in Africa, knows that Gandhi was actually deeply racist. In 1908, he was jailed and arrested for refusing to carry an identity pass. And in his notebooks, he actually wrote about how he was frustrated at the fact that he was jailed in the same cell with Kafirs, which was the derogatory term used for Black people. He thought he should have been jailed with white people. And so this is that kind of history. And so part of what I'm arguing in this project is that Blackness in everyday life in India is menacing in its dominant existence. So alongside cinematic representations of Black people, which I look at and I can talk more about in Q&A, are these ordinary and circulating anxieties about the so-called encroachment of waves of African migrants into urban centers across India. So these translate into insults like Kalu or Kalia. They translate into discrimination in housing, racial profiling, and widespread belief that Africans are drug peddlers, prostitutes, vigilante, and prostitutes. It translates into vigilante mob violence against African nationals. African nationals even talk about being openly taunted in the streets, with shopkeepers and passersby holding their noses when Africans move through public spaces. And in fact, this particular point kind of aligns with something I heard and saw when I was living in Bombay doing field work for what was then my dissertation project, which was on sort of queer activism and queer life in Bombay. I was shadowing a group of HIV outreach workers, and out of nowhere, this one Koti said, I could never sleep with a Nigerian man. They smell like meat. Or they smell, and it's probably from eating too much meat. So there was this connection made between desirability, race, and food consumption habits. And so in addition to kind of doing the work of echoing Black people as prostitutes, drug dealers, and cannibals, right? This phrase about Nigerians eating too much meat or Africans eating too much meat and thus being sexually undesirable also echoes the same kinds of things that are said about Muslims, the same kinds of things that are said about people from the Northeast, and the same kinds of things that are said about people from Dalit and Adivasi communities. And so what I want to say is that this scene of anti-Blackness points to what I think are the important sites of convergence between the violences of race, the violences of ethnicity, and the violences of caste, right? In particular, that anti-Blackness can often speak in the language of casteism, but I also want to be cautious about collapsing these things together as being the same, right? I think that I've seen a lot of talk recently about anti-Blackness as just kind of an extension of Hindu Brahminical supremacy. And I want to say that I think that what Africans living in urban centers in India are experiencing is something radically different in some ways from the violence of caste. It's not to say that they have no common point of connection, but to say that there are also things that are unique to this particular case, which is also a story about migration and movement and a global conversation, right, around anti-Blackness. And Black life is sort of devalued globally in ways that I think are important to tease and pull apart. And what struck me a lot about scenes like this one, where a group of sort of queer, trans, quote-the identified queer activists were sort of trading what was essentially an anti-Black joke, was that they were also fighting for recognition themselves, right? These were people who were constantly in the police officer, in police stations, in doctors' offices, working with lawyers and judges, asking, right, for particular forms of humanity and dignity to be given to them on the basis of their gender and sexual identity. And so it struck me that even in these moments where there's a so-called kind of radical queer or trans politic, right, there is still this kind of slippage in which Blackness is the other that can still be sort of picked and pulled apart. This really goes, I think, to one of the points that Grace raised, that even in talking about trans as a category, there are still categories within the category wherein violence, right, repeats itself and emerges in ways that do sort of further harm to people who are already, right, sort of socially stigmatized and harmed. And so I think this is a point across all three of our comments that might sort of be an important thread. Just checking my time. What I want to add here is that my time in India has reaffirmed for me that anti-Blackness is indeed a queer issue, one that exceeds small talk in the lanes of places of Mumbai Chawls, right? So for instance, in 2016, in his piece for the Daily O, titled "Indians Are Racist, but Africans Not Nice Either," queer scholar Ashley Tellis attempts to distract us from the virulent forms of racism experienced by Africans living in India, as well as experienced by Northeasterners, by rehearsing tired tropes of Africans as criminals, drug dealers, prostitutes, and homophobes. He writes, quote, "But I have not found Africans the friendliest people to me at all. I lived in Kishangarh for over 5 years and my homosexuality saw them being quite hostile to me." He continues in this article to suggest that their refusals to mix in with the local population makes Africans, quote, "like the people from the Northeast," end quote, who are, quote, "egregiously endogamous, do not mix with mainland Indians, and are quite racist to us too," end quote. Beyond this facile conflation of Northeasterners and Africans as belonging to supposedly, well, at least for India, nebulous categories like race, Tellis's words not only erase extant and fabulous instances of Northeastern and African queerness, but also stage race as a multifaceted problem for both heteronormative society's order and queer safety. And what I mean by this is quite simple, that both Africans and Northeasterners are constructed as simultaneously undesirable and dangerous subjects because they threaten the order of heteronormative social spaces and housing societies with their food, their dress, their noise, and their sex. And yet at the same time, their assumed homophobia, and perhaps also transphobia in this formulation, mark them as simultaneously threatening to the lives of queers like Tellis. Holding up the fiction of African homophobia repeats the move that is often made by Suvarnas when pushed on their casteism or Islamophobia, to paint Dalits and Muslims as inherently anti-queer and Dalit Muslim queers as being in need of saving. And think here about the sort of more recent discourses that have emerged in the wake of what's happening in Kashmir and Jammu, for instance. The supposed intolerance of the Black, Dalit, Muslim, Northeastern figure comes to stand as sound justification for their violence and discrimination. And there are a litany of other examples I can point to here. So for instance, in 2014, when Somnath Bharti, who's part of the Aam Aadmi Party, led a vigilante raid against a group of African women in Kirki Extension, Delhi, and basically forced these women to give a public urine sample. Or in a 2018 incident in which a mob surrounded a house in Delhi occupied by Tanzanians and Nigerians because there were rumors that they had abducted children and were cannibalizing them. What I'm suggesting that in all of these different iterations, that by connecting African nationals to social ill, Blackness is vilified within larger social milieus, and social ill is displaced from larger structural inequalities to African immigrant communities. So Africans become the blame, right, for all of the things that detract from India's sort of neoliberal rise and ascendancy. So crime, poverty, prostitution become Black problems. And that is an issue that I think needs to be unpacked. And so what I'm arguing in this project and what I want to think about out loud is how Blackness poses more than just a racial problem. So one rooted in uneven and unequal distributions of rights, political recognition, or socioeconomic opportunity. What I want to say is that it's not about making better laws. Blackness is, what I'm arguing, an aesthetic problem in many of the ways that caste, religion, class, ethnicity, transness, and other marginalized subject positions pose similar aesthetic problems. By aesthetics, I reference something more than a philosophy of theory, of art, or beauty, but I really mean a way of inhabiting a space, a particular location, a way of looking and becoming. As anthropologist Lawrence Cohen suggests in his writings on fashion, in this case, he's talking about dress as a form of social mobility. He says that, quote, beauty as a project and demand is one way for thinking about the differential stakes in futurity. So in the future, so we think about the future, or we imagine the future through the ways in which we understand what is beautiful or what is desirable. So for a lot of gay men, right, marriage and children is imagined as a beautiful, desirable future. And what I'm trying to say here is that anti-Blackness emerges from an imagining of a future life in India in which Black people are not part of that equation and ought not be part of that equation. And I'm saying that that's akin to the ways in which other marginalized subjects are also radically erased from futural politics in India. So what I'm arguing here is that for Africans in India, these differential stakes emerge at the same sites where Black bodies come into social view. Their disruptive entries into narratives of film or into the lanes of places like Kirki can produce not simply reactions of revulsion and horror, but also expose aesthetic regimes that color future aspirations of development, modernity, and progress, to which Blackness is seen as neither in alignment with nor desirable in and of itself. So similarly, the sound of the Hidra's clap, the Hindutva panics over love jihad, the ongoing Suvarna anxieties about justice for Dalits are also aesthetic problems. The entree of Africans, Muslims, trans people, and Dalits into spaces cordoned off for dominant communities curates narratives of social undoing and upheaval. So for instance, if we look at the Trans Act's need for certification panels and to criminalize sex work and begging, and to paint trans people as victims in need of saving. This is about refusing the kinds of unruly behaviors that dominant, mostly Suvarna sort of politicians imagine as not being part of a more sort of progressive neoliberal India. And so what I'm arguing is that, for instance, the way these kinds of acts of rescue and reform, which are akin to the same projects that are rehearsed on the bodies of sex workers, hereditary performers, Dalit women, and a range of other social groups, and aspire to enact nationalist programs of beautification through reproducing state desires for social and sexual control. So thus, anxieties expressed over individual, communal, and social undoing, so this kind of panic in the case I'm looking at of Black people living and thriving across various cities in India, isn't about speaking the language of law or politics, right? These anxieties are not just about like illegal drugs and about prostitution. They're really about a larger sense of the kinds of hope and aspiration that people put into sort of public life and public spaces. And so under the guise of words like modernity, development, rights, and even at times freedom, what I'm suggesting here is that perhaps one of the connections between anti-Black violence and the experiences that trans people, that Dalit people, that Muslims are facing in India is that these communities are incredibly freighted by the immeasurable burden of responsibility for these kinds of neoliberal dreams of progress, desire, futurity, success, right, that India is aspiring to. And in an attempt to sort of shore off, right, the structural reasons why violence continues for these communities, right? The claim is to just say, well, these folk are backwards and are clearly not doing enough or not doing their part to sort of help in this larger narrative of sort of liberal sort of progression. And so I'm really in this project and hopefully in this conversation trying to think out loud about how the kinds of experiences that I'm looking at when I'm thinking about this project on race are, again, to sort of quote one of my favorite kind of Indian English phrases, same but different.